And so please join with me and provide a warm Rockingham County welcome to Senator Ted Cruz.
And as you can hear, it is a standing ovation for the senator. A lot of whooping going on. A lot of whooping going on.
Oh yeah, this is one heck of a reception.
Thank you
even
so
people
very much.
Standing on chairs to get a better view.
Not only that, but you have to remember, there's a lot of establishment Republicans here too.
Yeah, and they're still cheering.
Yes.
I wonder if the establishment Republicans call it opposition research, like us reading the New York Times.
Wow.
He's on.
You know, with that kind of reception, it's almost like y'all don't read the New York Times. Well, I'll tell you, I spent all week down in Washington, D.C. So it is great to be back in America. I'm particularly thrilled to be here with my family, with my wife, Heidi. She is beautiful, she is brilliant, she is, I think, exceptional in every regard except for unusually poor eyesight. And she's my best friend in the entire world. And we also have our two precious angels, Caroline, who's 6. Caroline, wave. And Catherine, who's 4. And I don't know about your house, but in my house, it's very hard for Daddy to compete with an iPhone. But I'll start with sharing a couple of stories about the girls since they're here. You know, I'm reminded about 3 years ago when Caroline was 3 and Catherine was a little bitty baby. We were vacationing down at the beach. We were there with some friends of ours, another couple, who had 2 little girls as well. And we were getting ready to head out to dinner. And Caroline really wanted to go in the car with her friends, and there wasn't room. She had to go in the car with us. And so Caroline dropped to the floor, began kicking and screaming and throwing a temper tantrum. I'm sure none of y'all ever had that happen with your kids. I'm certain it was entirely our fault. Now, I'll tell you, Heidi is tough. And Heidi had, shall we say, a very frank and direct conversation with this young lady. And she straightened up, and we went to dinner. And that night, we got back to the hotel room, and Caroline is on her knees saying her evening prayers. And she looks up, and she goes, "Dear Jesus, tonight, we had a situation." And she said, "I'm not sorry, but it's not going to happen again." A second story was about 2 years ago. Both girls were up in D.C. It was in the fall. And we were driving down to Mount Vernon for the afternoon. It was a Sunday afternoon. We were going to take the girls to see George Washington's home. We were driving down the George Washington Parkway. It was one of those beautiful fall days, those kind of days you have up here that are just exquisite, where the colors are red and orange, and you can just smell autumn in the air. And we're driving down, and every one of you as a parent, you know that children are very, very different, that God makes them uniquely different. Catherine, our baby, is the essence of sweetness. She will crawl in your lap. She will hug on you. That's just who Catherine is. Caroline, on the other hand, is a rascal. So we're driving along, and the girls are having a conversation in the back seat. Catherine's sitting over on this side in her car seat. Caroline is in her car seat behind me, kicking the back of my seat as she usually does. And Heidi and I are listening to them talk. And Caroline asks her little sister, she says, "Catherine, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And Catherine says, "I want to work in the U.S. Senate. I want to work with Daddy." And Caroline goes, "Oh, that's boring." She says, "We're going to be rock stars." And then she tosses out the zinger. "Besides, Daddy will be dead by then." It's a real conversation. I'm not making this up. I kind of wondered if maybe Caroline had been speaking with Republican leadership. Well, this past week has been a quiet week. Not really much of anything happened. On Monday, I'm proud to say, I announced my candidacy for President of the United States. I have to tell you, in the last 5 days, the energy, the enthusiasm has been electric. I think people are fed up. They're fed up with the last 6 years. They're fed up with economic stagnation. They're fed up with Obamacare. They're fed up with a continual assault on our constitutional rights. And they're ready to turn the page. They're ready to look on. You know, if you listen to my announcement speech, I think in 30 minutes, I believe I said the word Obama once. There's a reason for that. It's time to turn the page and move forward. At this point, millions of people across the country recognize what we're doing isn't working. This isn't a matter of right or left. This isn't a matter of Democrat or Republican. This is common sense. It ain't working. And I think millions of Americans are ready to get back to the principles that made America great. Instead of the economic stagnation we've seen for 6 years. Imagine an America where small businesses are booming and creating jobs and opportunity is plentiful for everyone. Imagine young people, instead of coming out of school wondering, how on earth am I going to pay back these school loans? Imagine young people coming out of school with 4, 5, 6 job offers. You know, that has been the history of this country. If we get back to jobs and growth and opportunity, that comes from small businesses. Small businesses create 2/3 of all new jobs in our country. And you know, there's a basic cause and effect. When you have a federal government that hammers the living daylights out of small businesses, that puts in place trillions of crushing new taxes, that sends regulators like locusts to devour small businesses, inevitably what happens is growth goes away. Opportunity goes away. And people get trapped. But there's a flip side to that cause and effect. Every time in history we have pursued tax reform and regulatory reform, getting the tax collector out of here, pulling the regulators back, we have seen incredible economic growth, whether in the 1920s, in the 1960s, or the 1980s. You know, one great thing for folks in New Hampshire to do is remind all of our friends in Massachusetts, go listen to John F. Kennedy in the 1960s talking about tax cuts. Listen to John F. Kennedy talking about when we reduce taxes, what happens is it unchains small businesses and creates jobs and opportunity. If John F. Kennedy were given that speech today, the media would label him a right-wing nut job. Tax reform and regulatory reform. When it comes to tax reform, we need to move to a simple, flat tax. Where every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. And we can abolish the IRS. Now, there are a lot of people in Washington who say, gosh, that's unrealistic. You can't do anything like that. You just have to fiddle around the edges. You can't have real, meaningful reform. I'll tell you, tax reform and the flat tax is an issue that I think has changed considerably. For a lot of years, Steve Forbes worked very hard to begin building the intellectual foundation, the public support for a flat tax. I think in the last 6 years, the issue's changed. The last 6 years, we've seen the weaponization of the IRS. The IRS going after those perceived to be President Obama's political enemies. Now, if you follow ordinary Washington rules, we can't abolish the IRS. So we've got to change the rules. How do we get it done? We build a grassroots movement that rises up and demands enough is enough. We want fundamental reform. We want a flat tax, and we want to get Washington out of our lives. Look, New Hampshire understands very well live free or die.
Yes, we do.
It was not an accident that on Monday when I announced my candidacy, it was the 240th anniversary of a young lawyer named Patrick Henry who stood up and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And the only way we'll get something like fundamental tax reform through Washington is if we see a movement, a mandate coming from the people that demands it, so that we change the incentives in Washington so it becomes politically more risky to do the wrong thing than it is to do the right thing. When it comes to regulatory reform, the single most important, we should repeal every word of Obamacare. Now, there are a lot of Republicans in Washington who are resigned to Obamacare remaining a permanent feature of our economy. Once again, the answer to changing that is a movement and mandate from the people that says enough is enough. This thing is a train wreck. It isn't working. It has cost millions of Americans their jobs, their health care, their doctors. It is causing health insurance premiums here in New Hampshire to skyrocket. It is absolutely unconstitutional. If it comes from the people, we can get it done. And it is my intention in 2016 to make this election a referendum on abolishing the IRS and repealing Obamacare. And let me give you another idea that in Washington is viewed as a radical idea. We need to follow the Constitution. You know, I want to refer to the words of someone who considers himself an eminent and learned constitutional scholar, who said with regards to executive amnesty that the president has no legal authority to grant amnesty. He said that 22 times. And that, of course, is Barack Obama. Well, and in fact, the language he used, he said, just a few months ago, he said, "I am not an emperor." That was his explanation for why he couldn't grant amnesty. He said, "I am not an emperor." Then what happened the last election? He got shellacked. And apparently, suddenly, he became an emperor. Look, this is a fundamental threat to rule of law. It's a fundamental threat to individual liberty. And we need to get back to a president who understands that the Constitution means what it says.
You're here.
Instead of a federal government assaulting the Bill of Rights, assaulting our First Amendment rights, our free speech, our religious liberty, imagine a federal government that championed the religious liberty of every American. Instead of trying to ban our ammunition, imagine a federal government that defended the right to keep and bear arms for every law-abiding citizen. Imagine a federal government that defends our right to privacy and stops snooping in the cell phones and emails of law-abiding citizens. Imagine a federal government that honors the 10th Amendment. Or as President Obama calls it, the what? That recognizes the fundamental limitations on the authority of the federal government, that those powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. And that means there are areas the federal government has a responsibility to defend this nation, to stand by the men and women of the military, to secure our borders. But there are other areas where the federal government has no business, areas like education. And we need to repeal every word of Common Core. And instead of a president who retreats from the world, instead of a president who boycotts Prime Minister Netanyahu, imagine a president who says, I will stand unapologetically with the nation of Israel. Imagine a president who says, we will defeat radical Islamic terrorism. And we will call it by its name. Imagine a president who says, under no circumstances will Iran be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. You know, just a week ago, I was on MSNBC. Was doing the Morning Joe show. And they were asking me if I regretted signing a letter with 46 other senators to Iran defending our Constitution. My response was, the only thing I regretted was that, like John Hancock, my signature wasn't larger. So the Ayatollah could read it without his reading glasses. You know, if you listen to Washington, if you listen to conventional wisdom, they'll tell you everything that we've been talking about here today is extreme. It's radical. It can't be done. Any of y'all remember the movie The Usual Suspects? Yeah. There's a line in that movie, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the left has ever played is convincing conservatives that America doesn't agree with us. These are common sense principles. These are the values that every small town, every small business, families for hundreds of years in America have understood. How do we turn it around? Listen, it will not come from Washington. Washington is fundamentally broken. It will only come from you. It will only come from the American people. From millions of courageous conservatives rising up to reignite the promise of America. I'm here today asking for your support. I'm here today asking for your help, because the way we are going to turn this country around is going to be every woman and man in this room reaching out to your friends, to your loved ones, to your neighbors, to your co-workers, and saying there is a better way. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think today is very, very much like the late 1970s. I think the parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. In fact, the one person in America thrilled with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter.
Harry Reid.
Who?
Harry Reid.
That would be the former senator from Nevada?
Yeah.
And we remember what happened in 1980. 1980, millions of men and women just like the men and women in this room, many of them exactly the men and women in this room, rose up and said what we're doing isn't working. there is a better way, and it came not from Washington, but from the American people. It became the Reagan Revolution, and it turned this country around. The simplest and best word of encouragement I can give to you is the same thing is happening today. All over this country, I'll give you a simple illustration. When we launched the campaign on Monday, we had 1 week left in this reporting quarter. And we set a goal in our campaign. We wanted to try to raise $1 million in a week. Well, I'm sorry to tell you we did not hit that goal. We ended up raising $1 million in the very first day. And 3 days into it, we crossed the $2 million mark. $95% of our donations have been $250 or less. Look, the Washington special interests, they're going to have their candidates. By the way, if you see a candidate who is embraced by Washington, run and hide. But our strength is something very different. And I want to close with just telling this story, and then we're going to take a few minutes of questions. But I want to tell a story from when I was running for Senate in Texas. And in Texas, just like in this race, all the money, all the institutional voices in the Republican Party were against us. Nobody thought we had a prayer. And in fact, you would read in the paper every day, there's no way on earth Cruz can get elected to the Senate. It's impossible. You guys are numbskulls for even imagining this is possible. Well, we had an event we were doing down in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Now, it's a very Democratic party of the state, very socioeconomically depressed part of the state, about 80% Hispanic, right on the river. We had a gathering on one Saturday night, about 300 people that were there. And the chairman of the county Republican Party, he stood up and said, you know, most Republicans, when they come down to the Rio Grande Valley, they go to the country club and they do a $1,000 a plate fundraiser. And he said, Ted is different. He said, this is not a fundraiser. He said, Ted is here to listen to you, to hear your concerns, to have a conversation with you. Now, I got up, I said, Javier, thank you for the great warm welcome. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here. I got to disagree with one thing you said. You said this is not a fundraiser. Everything we do is a fundraiser. I said, look, if you have the capacity to max out, God love you, we need the money, I promise you we will spend it to good purposes, carrying a message of freedom in the Constitution to the people of this state. But if you can't max out, everyone here can give $25 or $50 or $100. And I'll tell you part of the reason that matters so much is when you give 25 or 50 or $100, you got skin in the game. Suddenly you're invested. You're going to show up and vote. You're going to talk to your friends and neighbors. It becomes your fight. That is the only way we can win. And so one thing I would encourage each of you, just as I did down in the Rio Grande Valley, I would encourage every one of you to go to tedcruz.org. Sign up to volunteer. Talk with our team. Ethan and David, both wave your hands and introduce yourself. So Ethan is here in New Hampshire. He's here full-time on our team, and his job is organizing and helping bring together a grassroots army across this state. And David is based down in Houston at the campaign headquarters and is focused very much on New Hampshire as well. We need your help. I would encourage you to come sign on, but I would also encourage every one of you, go to tedcruz.org and contribute whatever you're able for the very same reason. We need the resources, but even better, we need the skin in the game. Because it's going to have to come from the people just like it did in 1980. I am convinced 2016 is going to be an election like 1980. It took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan. And I'm convinced the most long-lasting legacy of Barack Obama is going to be a new generation of leadership in the Republican Party that stands for liberty and the Constitution. And with that, I am happy to answer or dodge any question you like. Yes, sir.
GrokTV.